Jake had always been fascinated by abandoned places. The thrill of exploring forgotten buildings, capturing their decay on camera, and imagining the lives once lived within their walls was intoxicating. So when he heard about Penhurst State School and Hospital, a sprawling complex of abandoned buildings with a dark history, he knew he had to see it for himself. Penhurst, located in Spring City, Pennsylvania, had been a state-run institution for the mentally and physically disabled from 1908 to 1987. It gained notoriety for its inhumane conditions and alleged abuse of patients before finally being shut down after a series of lawsuits and investigations. Jake convinced his friend Mike to join him on the exploration. They arrived at the site late one autumn afternoon, parking their car a good distance away to avoid detection. As they approached the looming buildings, an eerie silence enveloped them. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the overgrown grounds, giving the place an even more foreboding atmosphere. They found an entry point through a broken window and slipped inside. The air was heavy with the musty scent of decay. Peeling paint hung from the walls like tattered skin, and debris littered the floors. Jake's flashlight beam danced across abandoned wheelchairs and hospital beds, silent witnesses to the institution's troubled past. As they moved deeper into the complex, Jake felt a growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Mike seemed to sense it too, his usual bravado replaced by nervous glances over his shoulder. In what appeared to be an old day room, they found a wall covered in patient artwork. Faded crayon drawings depicted stick figures with exaggerated smiles, some with missing limbs or extra appendages. Jake snapped a few photos, the flash momentarily illuminating the room. That's when they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere down the hall. Jake and Mike exchanged worried glances. Probably just the wind, Mike whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. They cautiously made their way toward the sound. As they got closer, Jake could swear he heard whispering mixed in with the tapping. His heart raced as they turned a corner and found themselves in a long corridor lined with patient rooms. They burst out of the building, gasping for air. The scream faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. As they caught their breath, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the fading light, he could see dozens of faces pressed against the windows of the upper floors, watching them. Jake blinked, and the faces were gone. He turned to Mike, who was staring at the building with wide, terrified eyes. "Did you see?" Jake began, but Mike cut him off. "We need to leave, now." They ran back to their car, hearts pounding. As they drove away, Jake couldn't resist looking back one last time. In the rearview mirror, he saw a solitary figure standing in the middle of the road behind them, arm raised as if waving goodbye. Jake never returned to Penhurst, but the experience haunted him. He researched the history of the institution obsessively, learning about the lives of the patients who had been confined there. He discovered stories of experimental treatments, abuse, and neglect that made his skin crawl. Months later, while reviewing the photos from that day, Jake noticed something he hadn't seen before. In one of the images of the day room, partially hidden behind a broken chair, was a small figure. It appeared to be a child, but its face was blurred and distorted. Jake knew it was impossible. They had been alone in that building. And yet, there it was, captured in the harsh light of his camera flash, a ghostly reminder of Penhurst's tragic past. He often wondered about the scream they'd heard and the faces in the windows. Were they merely products of an overactive imagination fueled by the building's oppressive atmosphere? Or had they experienced something truly supernatural? Jake never found definitive answers, but his experience at Penhurst changed him. He became an advocate for preserving the memory of such institutions, not as playgrounds for thrill seekers, but as solemn reminders of a dark chapter in history. The echoes of Penhurst stayed with him, a chilling testament to the lingering pain of those who had been forgotten and abandoned. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through empty streets, Jeg sometimes thought he could still hear that haunting scream, calling out across time, begging to be remembered. Sarah had always been fascinated by the paranormal. As an amateur ghost hunter, she'd explored her fair share of supposedly haunted locations, but nothing could have prepared her for the night. Located in Louisville, Kentucky, Waverly Hills was once a tuberculosis hospital that saw thousands of deaths during its operation from 1910 to 1961. Stories of ghostly apparitions, unexplained noises, and shadowy figures had made it a popular destination for paranormal enthusiasts. Sarah convinced her best friend, Emily, to join her on an overnight investigation. They arrived at the imposing Gothic structure just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the crumbling facade. The tour guide, a grizzled man named Tom, greeted them with a grim smile. "You ladies sure you want to stay the night?" he asked, eyeing their equipment. "Waverly has a way of getting under your skin." Sarah nodded confidently, but she couldn't ignore the chill that ran down her spine as they stepped inside. The air was heavy with the weight of history and decay. Their footsteps echoed through empty corridors once filled with the coughs of the dying. Tom led them through the building, recounting its tragic history. He showed them the infamous body chute, a 500-foot-long tunnel used to discreetly remove the bodies of those who had succumbed to the disease. Sarah felt a deep sadness as she imagined the countless lives lost within these walls. As night fell, Tom left them to their investigation, warning them to be careful and to respect the spirits. Sarah and Emily set up their equipment in the third-floor hallway, known for its paranormal activity. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. Hours passed with little activity. Sarah was beginning to feel disappointed when suddenly their meter spiked. The air grew cold, and Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide. Sarah strained her ears and caught what sounded like a faint whisper coming from one of the rooms. They cautiously approached, their flashlights illuminating peeling paint and rusted bed frames. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a child crying. Sarah's heart raced as she stepped into the room. The crying abruptly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. That's when they saw it, a small, shadowy figure standing in the corner. It was the size of a child, but something about its proportions seemed off, inhuman. Sarah raised her camera with shaking hands and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the room for a split second, and the figure vanished. But when Sarah checked the camera's display, her blood ran cold. The photo showed not a child, but a dark, twisted shape with glowing eyes. Suddenly, every piece of equipment they had brought began to malfunction. Their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The EMF meter shrieked, its needle pinned to the maximum reading. Sarah felt something brush against her arm, cold as ice. Emily screamed, and Sarah turned to see her friend being pulled backwards by an unseen force. Without thinking, Sarah lunged forward and grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her away from whatever had hold of her. They ran blindly through the dark corridors, the sound of shuffling footsteps and whispers all around them. Objects clattered to the floor in their wake, as if thrown by invisible hands. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as they finally burst out of the building into the cool night air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car. As they sped away from Waverly Hills, Sarah caught a glimpse of a figure standing in one of the upper windows, watching them leave. In the days that followed, Sarah struggled to make sense of what had happened. The photo she had taken disappeared from her camera, along with all their other evidence. Emily refused to speak about that night, and their friendship became strained. Sarah found herself unable to shake the feeling that something had followed her home from Waverly Hills. She would wake in the night to the sound of whispers, only to find her room empty. Shadows in the corners of her eyes seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She researched Waverly Hills obsessively, trying to find an explanation for what they had experienced. She learned of other investigators who had encountered similar phenomena: shadowy figures, disembodied voices, and unexplained forces. Months passed, and the experiences gradually faded. But Sarah was forever changed by that night at Waverly Hills. She gave up ghost hunting, unable to face the possibility of encountering something like that again. Years later, Sarah still couldn't bring herself to look at old photographs or drive past hospitals at night. The shadows of Waverly Hills had left an indelible mark on her psyche, a chilling reminder that some places are better left unexplored and some mysteries are better left unsolved. As she lay in bed each night, Sarah found herself listening for whispers in the dark, always wondering if the spirits of Waverly Hills were still watching, waiting for her to return to the shadows where they dwelt. Mark had always been drawn to places with dark histories. As a seasoned urban explorer, he'd visited abandoned asylums, forgotten prisons, and crumbling mansions. But nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered on Poveglia Island. Located in the Venetian lagoon, Poveglia had a sinister reputation. It had served as a quarantine station for plague victims, a mental asylum, and was rumored to be one of the most haunted places in the world. Despite strict regulations prohibiting visits, Mark was determined to see it for himself. He convinced a local fisherman to take him to the island under the cover of darkness. As they approached, the dilapidated bell tower loomed against the night sky, a silent sentinel guarding the island's secrets. "You sure about this?" the fisherman asked, his weathered face etched with concern. "There's a reason locals won't come here." Mark nodded, his excitement overshadowing any apprehension. He stepped onto the overgrown shore, the crunch of gravel under his feet sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "I'll be back at dawn," the fisherman said, already turning his boat around. "Don't make me come looking for you." Alone on the island, Mark switched on his headlamp and began to explore. The grounds were a tangle of ivy-covered ruins and dense undergrowth. He made his way towards the former asylum building, its windows dark and gaping like empty eye sockets. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Broken furniture and rusted medical equipment littered the floors. Mark's light caught the glint of shattered glass and what looked unsettlingly like scratch marks on the walls. As he ventured deeper into the building, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional scurry of unseen creatures in the walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. In what appeared to be an old operating theatre, Mark found a collection of antiquated surgical tools spread out on a rusted tray. A chill ran down his spine as he imagined the procedures that might have been performed here. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere above him. Mark's heart raced as he spun around, his light dancing across the decaying walls. "Hello," he called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. There was no response, but as he listened intently, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of whispers. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a cacophony of indistinct voices just on the edge of hearing. Mark decided it was time to leave the building. As he turned to go, his light fell upon a figure standing in the doorway. It was only there for a split second, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it, before vanishing. Panic gripped him as he ran through the corridors, the whispers growing louder with each step. He burst out of the building, gasping for air, only to find himself enveloped in an unnatural fog that had descended on the island. Disoriented, Mark stumbled through the mist, desperately trying to find his way back to the shore. The whispers followed him, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like agonized screams in the distance. As he ran, he tripped over something half buried in the soil. His light revealed a human skull, its empty sockets seeming to stare accusingly at him. Mark scrambled backward, only to feel the ground give way beneath him. He tumbled down a steep embankment, landing hard on a bed of loose stones. Dazed, he looked up to find himself in what appeared to be an old mass grave. Bones protruded from the earthen walls around him, a grim reminder of the island's tragic history. The whispers were deafening now, and in his panicked state, Mark began to understand fragments of what they were saying. They spoke of pain, of abandonment, of terrible experiments performed in the name of science. And they were angry at this intruder who dared to disturb their rest. Mark clawed his way out of the pit, driven by pure adrenaline. He ran blindly through the fog, branches whipping at his face, until he finally broke through to the shore. The fisherman wasn't due 4 hours, but Mark waded into the cold waters of the lagoon. Determined to swim, he had to. To his immense relief, he saw the lights of a boat approaching. The fisherman had returned early, sensing that something was wrong. As they sped away from Poveglia, Mark looked back to see the fog lifting, the island's silhouette stark against the pre-dawn sky. In the years that followed, Mark was never able to fully shake the experience on Poveglia. He abandoned urban exploration, plagued by nightmares of whispers in the dark and bones reaching out from earthen graves. He researched the island's history obsessively, learning of the thousands who had died there over the centuries. He read accounts of other explorers who had experienced similar phenomena, ghostly encounters, disembodied voices, and overwhelming feelings of dread. Mark knew he would never return to Poveglia, but a part of him had never left that haunted island. On quiet nights, he would find himself listening for whispers on the wind, a chilling reminder that some places are steeped in too much tragedy to ever truly be at peace. The secrets of Poveglia Island remained buried, but their echoes would haunt Mark for the rest of his days. If you enjoy this content and want to see more, please subscribe and turn on notifications to support the channel.